Hi, welcome to Asian Sky Group's 2020 Infrastructure Report. As part of our Infrastructure Week, which will take place next week, on the second day of our Infrastructure Week, we are featuring a number of video clips from a number of different businesses involved in the infrastructure industry, if you will, providing FBO, MRO, and other services from across the region, trying to provide a little bit of local flavor to complement the data that's provided in the report. Today, we're very happy to have on the phone Chris Constantinides from Airflite in Perth. An interesting position, an interesting environment, a mature market, as we would call it, Chris. But please take a moment, just introduce yourself, and then also, because you do everything, you can go down the list. We have enough time for you to tell it all. Go down the list of all the different services you provide, because again, as we kind of talked just before we got online here, you are certainly one of the tip to tail, if you will, service providers. And so you do everything.
Yeah, so look, my name's Chris Constantinides. I'm the general manager of Airflite. Airflite is a West Australian headquartered business, but we are spread across the country and we extend our services into Southeast Asia. Airflite is predominantly in the MRO business for general aviation, business aviation, rotary, and also some defence work. We sell spare parts, we do aircraft leasing, we do pilot training, we do component repair and overhaul, we do aircraft management. We are very diverse, and we're diverse because we need to be. Relevant to this conversation, we're also an owner of a number of our facilities around the country, including our headquarters where I'm sitting now at Perth Airport, which is a double 737 sized facility with workshops and offices and FBO and everything all around it. So
you're doing aircraft sales and flying school?
Aircraft sales and flying school, yeah. Yep. And aircraft leasing is a large part of our business as well. And that's the aircraft leasing side of our business is more in the single engine side of the business. So in an Australian context, I believe we're the fifth largest aircraft owner by fleet size, not by fleet value, obviously, based on the size of our aircraft versus others. But we are quite prominent in that space.
How big is that fleet?
That fleet is pushing 50 units at the moment. So it's fairly sizable, and we expect that's going to grow over the next couple of years with a few of the programs that we're involved in. And for commercial reasons, I can't say more than that, but we do expect that there's going to be growth. And that's, look, unrelated to the infrastructure discussion, but we do believe that the pilot training challenge that existed and was clearly identified 12 months ago is still going to exist in a post-COVID world. It's just going to take time to return to that moment. Now, at the point that it returns to that moment, the attrition of people leaving the industry because of COVID-related concerns will further exacerbate the problem. Mm-hmm. The fact that we're also going to have maybe 12 months, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years of an absence of the traditional pipeline feeding those skills into the market means the problem is going to be perhaps, albeit reduced because of reduced demand, but the problem is then going to be, in a counter sense, it's going to be increased because of those other factors, the attrition rate that isn't natural, that's beyond normal because of the COVID environment and the absence of that pipeline. So we're fairly...
I think a lot of people's perceptions are that the market is flooded with all these pilots now, and that it's, there's an oversupply. And again, I think if you correctly pointed out, they're looking only at one side of the equation, if you will. Yeah. It's the other side of it is the attrition rate, and some that will just give up on the business, if you will, or be forced out of the business. So.
And your consequence of the attrition rate is the skills and experience. So we can flood the market with newly graduated, young, enthusiastic people ready to get into pilot training. But if you've lost all your captains because they've chosen to retire early, or they've switched into other industries, or they've become comfortable with a life that means they're not away every few days from family and friends, there's a concern there. So I do think depending on the time it takes to return to normal or degrees of normal in the demand levels, that we do feel that aircraft leasing, pilot training, aircraft sales in that particular space is going to continue to be positive. However, that said, in the short term, there's no doubt that there's a huge impact on pilots, and how individual governments can support that sector and support those individuals so that those skills are available when the various countries need them to be available is an important consideration.
Yeah, because as you say, the industry is just trying to deal with the amount of, if you will, the fleet that's still on the ground. So
yeah.
Now for Airflite, now you're in the head office, which is in Perth. Where are your, and I correct me if I'm wrong, I think most of your the FBO and your MRO facilities are in Perth as well. But as you mentioned, you do have other facilities around Australia.
Correct.
So can you give us some scope of that?
Sure. So in Western Australia, which is obviously on the west coast of the country, we have head office at Perth Airport, which here we have MRO, FBO, rotary wing MRO, spare parts, component repair and overhaul.
Did you recently go through an expansion?
We did. So we extended the Perth Airport facility. So when we originally designed this and completed this at the end of November 2012, we had provisioned for extension capacity.
Just as a strange side, I went onto Google Map, because I wanted to see where the facility was. And if you zoom in, it shows the extension still being constructed. But if you zoom out, it shows it complete. So I wasn't sure when it took place. But
no, it was overnight. We paid for a lot of overtime.
It's amazing. You guys down in Western Australia. Wow.
That's Australian efficiency. No.
So it was actually 2012.
It was 2012, the original structure, and then the extensions we finished probably in the last 18 months. But it was always, those extensions were always provisioned for, because what we didn't want to do, and this becomes relevant to the infrastructure discussion, is that here you can lease the land for 25 years, but you cannot own airport land. So the issue with that is that your amortization of your building is over 25 years, and at the end you have to hand back the keys to the building.
Long.
Which isn't long for the type of investment that we obviously spend in aviation, as all of your viewers and listeners will know. So that is problematic, but at the same time, we didn't want the split of facilities where it didn't make sense to have split of facilities. So we needed to provision for growth within this facility to try and not have a loss of connection to the various parts of our business. Because sure, we can put up another facility around the road if we need it, but then you've got the loss of structure, you've got decentralization of parts and administration and tech admin and all those sort of contributing factors that go into running a business. So we thought, if we can have everything co-located as much as possible, let's allow for it. That's what we did, and thankfully the extension has allowed us to grow within this space rather than go elsewhere.
Better efficiencies and just process flow and the whole 9 yards.
And look, we still have, so that's the Perth facility. We have a facility at Jandakot Airport, which is a general aviation airport for light and smaller aircraft predominantly. And out there we've got an MRO facility. We've got spare parts out there as well. We've got our flight training school at Jandakot Airport. We also have a facility north of Western Australia. So for any viewers or listeners that have been to the Swan Valley wine region in Western Australia, just north of that is a military base. And we have a presence at the military base there, repairing life support equipment and also doing armament for the BAE Hawk under subcontract. Then when we move further east in Adelaide, we have an FBO operation in Adelaide in conjunction with Cobham Aviation. When we move into Melbourne, we've got a facility at Moorabbin doing spare parts and aircraft sales, as well as aircraft hangarage. And then also in Melbourne, we have an FBO joint venture there as well, where we manage an FBO for a partnered organisation in Melbourne. And then in Williamtown, near Sydney, for those familiar with Australia, we operate at a defence base there, RAF base Williamtown, looking after armament and ejection seat components, again in support of a subcontractor BAE, for the end customer being the Royal Australian Air Force. So that's our spread of facilities around the country.
I think another time, another discussion is how you got into that business. Ejection seat. Okay. All right. Yeah. I see that.
Yeah.
Yep. It all flows. I get it. So.
Yeah, but I think it highlights our diversity when you can go from talking about rotary capability to injection fleets. It kind of highlights that we're quite diverse, because those two things definitely don't go together. So, so that's the geographical spread of our business, and around the major airports in Australia. As I said, you can't own the land, so you lease the land. You can own the buildings if you choose to, but then at the end of that lease, theoretically, you hand the building back, and you then lease back your building. Which, look, for someone like me who designed this and managed this particular building here, I'll be young enough for that still to hurt on the day that we have to hand the keys back to someone else and then pay for it. But that's business in this country, and that's airport business in this country. So that's the way it's run.
Okay. Well, as we talked earlier as well, I mean, pretty much when it comes to the Asia Pacific, certainly Australia is regarded as a mature market. General aviation, private aviation has been present in the market down there for quite some time. So when I ask about infrastructure challenges, I sort of expect a little bit of a different answer. When you're dealing with countries like China or Indochina, the challenges are usually quite simple. There just isn't any infrastructure. But interesting, if you can just give your perspective on the challenges, particularly in Australia, and whether there are some. And then, as you say, you do serve certainly Southeast Asia. So if you take sort of Australia first and then sort of expand that to talk about the other parts of Asia that you're active in, maybe we split it up that way. Get your comment on both.
So look, from an Australian perspective, the return on investment scenarios are skewed somewhat by that leasing arrangement with the land. Mm-hmm. So that remains a challenge, whereby you only have the building for 25 years, theoretically. So that creates an investment parameter that can be limiting.
Yep.
I think the timing from the identification of need through to the construction of a facility can be a 12 to 24 month process. So there are infrastructure challenges there that the moment you identify the opportunity, you can be 2 years away from solving that customer's problem because you don't have the facility. So having the infrastructure in some ways gives you a competitive advantage, but you also have the risk that goes with that. Yep. The financial risk, the business risk of holding that infrastructure if you don't have a designated purpose or revenue stream attached to it. I do think in Australia, the challenges that exist relative to infrastructure more broadly across the nation is in the area of regional funding. So there's a number of regional airports outside the major capital cities in Australia that are looking to develop their airports. And they're looking to do that because of what that'll generate in capability, what that'll do in terms of creating industry clusters and attracting capability, generating employment opportunities for people in those regions. And what we've seen historically is the Australian government's been good at issuing grants, and state governments have as well, to some of those regional airports to say, we want to put money into that airport to develop it, to pursue this type of aim. My concern in a post-pandemic world is how much of that funding, in a pandemic and post-pandemic world, is how much of that funding will continue to flow in that direction. Because the priorities are not necessarily going to be creating jobs for tomorrow, but it's going to be retaining the jobs that we have. Yep. So you can see a scenario where some of that regional infrastructure development funding may be allocated elsewhere. And that's the concern I have probably in the next couple of years for the regional airport funding. And I think that'll be a challenge for some of those regions. But by and large, the predominant challenge for the metropolitan areas for aviation infrastructure development is the process, the timing, the planning, the lease negotiations, the master planning limitations, if they are relevant in different cities and different airports. So there are a series of challenges there, but they're predominantly still the business challenges. And the key framework, that 25-year lease, certainly does change your investment parameters versus if you could have freehold land. but that's an accepted part of doing business here in Australia.
Well, do you think that there's enough? Or do you think the markets, as you said, the major metropolises, is there enough competitive FBOs and MROs, or is it too much? Is there oversupply, undersupply? How do you see the market as far as being served in that regard?
Look, I think from a purely commercial perspective, unless I had 100% market share, I'd always say there's too much. But I do think that there seems to be a reasonable balance. I think there's good competition. There are some cities where there probably could be more competition, but the volume doesn't justify that necessarily. And that's where you get organisations like Airflite that are multifaceted and multi-purpose. We're not just an FBO, we're a multitude of things, and the FBO happens to be one of the service offerings. So I think you end up with a number of diverse organisations being able to provide a suite of services. And we might be friends in one angle and we'll be competitors in another. But that whole balance makes the market what it is here. And there are certainly some cities where you could use a bit more competition, perhaps. But that said, I think there's a sufficient understanding in Australia that because of the lower volume relative to some other countries, you want to do well by that customer. You want to hold that customer. That customer is imminently valuable. So there is definitely... in some areas a lack of competition. In other areas, I think the balance is about right. But I don't think in areas with the lack of competition that it diminishes the customer service disciplines, because it's the lack of competition is driven by lack of customer volume. And in that context, the value of the customer is immense, and that ensures that your service levels remain really high. So I think in that perspective, and certainly looking at it from a customer perspective, the balance is right, because am I going to be looked after? Am I going to get good quality of service? Am I going to get competitive pricing? Yes, you are, because organisations don't want to lose your business. So I think overall that's quite...
In Australia, in an FBO, are you allowed to sell fuel?
Yes, we are. Yeah, so we have relationships with fuel companies, so we don't sell the fuel directly. But we have the relationships where we subcontract that supplier in to sell the fuel. And obviously, in an FBO environment, that's an important part of the revenue stream. In certain regional locations, the availability can be a consideration. But again, that's where the communication with FBOs around the country, they can then identify the risks and challenges related to your proposed journey and what that means. So we've got certainly good infrastructure here, good knowledge, good sharing of information. So there's no hesitation for Australian FBOs being able to support standard trips or very non-standard, very unique types of trips through the country.
Right. And then sort of taking that, what's your view of Asia Pacific? Maybe not necessarily northern Asia, if you will, but certainly South and Southeast Asia, which I'm sure you're more involved with.
We are. We're very involved in Southeast Asia, particularly through our MRO work and our parts network, and aircraft sales as well. We've got aircraft sales presence in Singapore, for example, and we consistently in Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, etc., doing MRO work. We do find, from an infrastructure perspective, the challenges in Asia sometimes is in the quality of the facilities. Some are brilliant, and then there's some that are decaying, and that represents a significant risk. And there are certain places we have refused to work in because of the health and safety considerations and the quality of work that we take extremely seriously. There are a number of Asian airports there are a number of Asian business people that approach us relative to Asian airports, saying, we've got this new airport, we want to set up an MRO joint venture, come and invest, let's do this together. We know we've got the customers, we've got the connections that are going to bring in the work. And that conversation will happen about every 2 months.
That's what I was going. I heard it before too.
Exactly. And
another provincial China airport.
Yes. And this is not to invalidate any of them, by the way. They all may have legitimate reasons and legitimate purposes. At the best of times, that has to be a carefully considered investment decision.
Yep.
And you have to be able to see through the sales talk and see where the legitimate demand exists and how that complements and augments your existing business as well as the existing capability and market. In a pandemic and post-pandemic world, everything becomes skewed. Your return on investment potentials, your return on asset potential, your availability of finance and the willingness of the broader financial market to invest in aviation and to put their money behind aviation projects, all of that is affected. So I do believe that the infrastructure world in Asia is going to be impacted by the willingness of the investment market to get behind aviation. And you can understand, for those who are not in aviation day to day, there'll be a high degree of trepidation about investing in aviation infrastructure until such time as you see a demand return that's similar to what we had prior to COVID running rampant. So you can expect there's going to be significant challenges there in the funding environment, which is going to stall a number of these projects unless they're backed by high net worth individuals or others that see beyond those challenges or have inherent reasons to invest regardless.
Now, since we're talking about COVID, what has been your experience through the pandemic? And I say through the pandemic because certainly having spoken to a lot of people, there may have been initially troughs, downward trends, but then there were upward trends as well. And there were a whole bunch of reasons for that. Certainly from talking with a number of people, a lot of people took the opportunity to do a lot of work on their airplanes, for instance. They're on the ground anyways. So a lot of the MRO facilities have been very busy, and it's been a good year for them. I mean, silver linings to a pandemic, you never kind of want to talk about that, but certainly for certain aspects of the industry, it has been okay. But certainly initially it wasn't, and then later it has been. So what has been your experience on the MRO side, for instance?
Look, I think you're right. We all would wish for a world in which the pandemic obviously didn't happen. That said, there are pluses and minuses to the environment we find ourselves in. The MRO environment initially, it sort of started to spread here in March, April in Australia to the point, and there was that level of unknown fear of what does this mean and how bad is this going to be? And I think that created a high degree of uncertainty in the market. We've been very, very fortunate in Australia in respects to our government response to COVID and the swift and strong measures that we've taken to limit the spread of COVID in this country. By and large, day-to-day life, particularly in Perth, we might be one of the most lucky places in the world. We can go to functions, we can go to restaurants, we can go to bars, we can do all that stuff normally.
A measure is always how much you hear about a place, and nobody's heard about Perth.
So look, we've been extremely fortunate. So I'm cognizant here that my comments relative to how we've been affected by COVID lack the perspective of some of our friends in countries like Indonesia and Singapore and Malaysia and other places where the responses have been different and the issues have been different. But for us here in Australia, the MRO work has increased.
And where has it increased? Again, talking to a lot of the MROs, it wasn't necessarily on like line maintenance because people aren't flying. It's been more on the heavy duty maintenance side.
Correct. It's the deeper maintenance side, and that's perfectly logical. And I think we've referenced this in some of our written responses to your publication. That if you're going to suffer from a lack of demand, that is the time to put your assets into a situation where they're getting that deeper maintenance and they're ready and available for an anticipated increase in demand.
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense. If my aircraft are not available, there's no demand for my aircraft, that's the time to bring forward whatever maintenance, refurbishment, whatever you can do to make those aircraft ready. And it also helps you retain.
But by bringing it forward, are you kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and then
you are, yeah.
yeah.
So depending on how much you're bringing forward and to what extent, you are manipulating your variable cost per hour.
Yep.
So there is a whole calculation that needs to be put into play there around what does that mean for your business and that particular individual asset. And there's no definitive formula that will fit every business or every aircraft or every operator. You have to make that decision. Now, you may be best putting the aircraft in storage. There's a whole, and we have some aircraft here that are in storage, some rotary wing aircraft in storage. So there's a number of considerations there that need to be taken into account. But we have seen an increase in maintenance demand. In the rotary sector, what we have found is that a number of operators will bring in contract labour from all over the world that are specialised in rotary. That contract labour, because of the visa limitations and the restrictions on entry, has been very limited. So that has forced elements of the market to look inward at what Australian capability exists. Right. And that has certainly benefited our rotary wing division in terms of the use of our skilled resources here.
Right. And any other areas in particular that
the up or down
brings to mind regarding COVID-19 and the impact?
Look, charter inquiries definitely increased, as you'd expect, particularly through that March and April period that I spoke of. FBO, by comparison, has decreased because the private jet movements in and out of Western Australia, both domestically and internationally, has been severely limited. But that said, there has also been a need for socially distanced terminals, if I can call them that, and that's where a number of the regional airline operators have been concerned about the crossover of flights, incoming and outgoing flights that depart an hour and a half away from each other, and you get clusters of the two flights mixing. And the customers, the mining and the oil and gas and the resource customers that are putting their employees on that plane don't want that group of employees to mix with that other company's group of employees, because naturally you don't want to take the risk of spreading a virus that didn't exist in either group to begin with. So that has generated a demand to try and spread that out a little bit, and we've been able to repurpose some of our FBO area as what we're calling a socially distanced terminal option for some of those providers, and that's been very successful for them and good for us, because it's allowed our FBO team to be repurposed for that requirement. And we're delivering something that we feel is of societal benefit. So overall, that's been a positive response to obviously a very negative global situation.
Yeah.
Other than that, parts has been up and down, but has been okay. And again, we've been fairly lucky in this country that things have been somewhat stable, and Airflite is not reliant on the discretionary spending of the public or on the revenue streams directly from your major airlines. So we have, like everyone in aviation, been affected to a degree, but we've been very fortunate that because of our diversity of capability and the markets that we service, I feel that we've been very fortunate by comparison to a number of other organisations.
Right. And we talked a little bit earlier, likewise, about what the government's been doing in support, and I guess some of the concerns that certainly post COVID-19 pandemic, whether a lot of that support remains, particularly for the regional airports, in particular in Perth. I mean, how has the government been supporting the industry there? And again, in a lot of the respondents, it's, they haven't singled out the aviation side of it. They've been providing relief to individuals and helping the community that way. But I don't know, maybe different in Perth.
Yeah, look, I'm one of my other roles in connection with Airflite is that I'm the chair in Western Australia of the Australian Industry and Defence Network. Okay. So that means that I'm involved and have been involved at a federal and state level in discussions regarding how to address industry needs. Yep. And that's been specifically towards the defence industry more than aviation. However, there are some common threads. State government here and federal government have been very strong in their response to COVID and very keen to protect employment, because obviously I see it almost as like a stimulus package proactively rather than reactively. So they're trying to stave off an economic problem rather than having to respond to it. So there's been a lot of money invested federally in a JobKeeper program that's designed to basically supplement the wages of people so that if you don't have full-time work for them, they're still making some money. If people are stood down for a period of time, they're still making some money. So that's been good at keeping you open.
Much the same here in Hong Kong. Much the same here in Hong Kong.
Yeah. So I think that's a wise move on the surface. I think it's good to support, obviously, your broad population and make sure they're employed. Our state government, again, our ministers are very focused on how to support industry and how to keep industry alive. Then this is broadly, not just in aviation. And that's why they've been so aggressive with the border closures at a state level, because they thought, well, if we can keep WA within WA ticking over, then we're going to be okay. There's going to be international implications and cross-border state and territory implications. But if WA is safe and open for business, then we're okay. And from an Airflite perspective, the fact that our regional airlines are still flying back and forth to mine sites has been an important factor in the aviation industry here remaining relatively robust. Obviously, the airlines, major airlines like Qantas and Virgin and others have been affected. There's no getting away from that. But from a state-based perspective and also from an Australian-based perspective of protecting the borders, being able to maintain as much business as usual as possible within those boundaries and giving consideration to the health information and the scientific information that's presented has been critical. So as long as we can maintain a minimal community spread and keep that under control, then that in itself is supporting aviation because it allows business as usual. Now, the challenge for those that operate internationally in aviation, that's the challenge because that's beyond the jurisdiction of Australia's political control. So that's where the vaccines and other things will play a role in putting industry back where it belongs. But I can say from personal knowledge, having spoken to federal and state ministers, the desire to keep industry going and industry pumping is at the forefront of their minds because they know that's what's going to keep people employed. And that's critical to, obviously, the economic health of the country.
You know, we have no domestic market, so every day is a bad day for Cathay Pacific. It's just, when they report their numbers every month, you just go, how do they survive? I mean, and likewise the airport here. I mean, it's just,
yeah.
Whereas,
and look, every airline in the world is going to face this problem. Like, how do they survive? And that's a frightening thought. It could. There's the potential that it will reshape, almost like reshaping a market through consolidation, but the consolidation won't be driven by acquisition. It'll be driven by destruction. And that's an awful thought that that's what faces our industry. My hope is that demand eventually returns to a level where people may wear a different hat or a different uniform the next day. But as long as they're employed and we retain those skills within industry, that those people who are passionate about aviation still have a chance to work in the sector, I think that will be a good outcome. So, look, we hope for a world free of a pandemic and that people in aviation can certainly stay in the business and get back into the business as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, the big discussion also is when that demand returns, what form will it take? Is it going to be the same mix that it was before, or is it a completely different mix? And particularly on that business traveler, I mean, we've all learned to live with Zoom, and so how much do we go back to what we were doing before, or just continue what we're doing now? So, lots of challenges. Now, if you had a magic wand, Chris, and you could fix all the problems affecting the industry when it comes to infrastructure, where would you wave your wand? Obviously, you would like a 99-year lease on land, at least, right?
I'd like the option of freehold, actually. But
freehold, okay, all right. Wow.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm greedy. Yeah. Look, I do think from an Australian perspective, we talk a lot from a government viewpoint of wanting to build Australian skills, wanting to develop Australian jobs and so on. I think we could see an environment where if that's the outcome that we want, how do we link demand and investment to that desired strategic outcome? And in that case, that would require strategic and financial bravery to say, this is what we want to do. We want to develop a centre of excellence in Australia for capability X, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to invest in the skilling and the training. We're going to invest in bringing in some of the best people from around the world in that particular capability. We're going to put money behind the facilities and a pipeline of educational institutions producing the apprentices that will become the experts of tomorrow. So I see if I was to lift capability in the country around particular areas or boost employment in aviation in Australia, it would be that whole approach. Because in the absence of that type of whole approach, you're asking someone to invest in a facility, possibly without the guarantee of work. You're asking someone to organise their business profile without the guarantee of a facility or capability. You can see very easily how those type of things break down until you're looking at a whole solution. Obviously, there are certain operators in region that have the power over the demand. Airlines are a great example where they basically own the demand and they can own the capability in response to that demand. So there's scenarios there, but they've traditionally been incentivised to do some of that work overseas because of cost considerations or others. It'll be interesting to see post-pandemic how that is affected, because the security of your supply chains, the reliability of your supply chains, the management of a health crisis can play a role then in your access to that capability. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes the dynamic. But if I had a magic wand, I do think reconsidering the timeframes of the leases or leasehold versus freehold land certainly will shift the investment decision making in favour of more investment versus less. And I do think linking demand to capability and seeing that as a whole project and attacking that as a whole project has benefit, but that requires leadership at a non-conflicted commercial level that I think draws in government naturally to those type of conversations.
I mean, for me, it would seem not too much effort would be required to establish Australia as a centre of excellence. I mean, I think people in the industry have fairly high regard for the industry in Australia already to begin with. And so, I mean, we don't regard you guys as slouches down there. I mean,
exactly, yeah. But I'm talking about a specific.
It wouldn't take much to push it over the top, if you will.
Agreed. So, what I'm suggesting is not that Australia is not seen as a centre of excellence or capable. There are specific areas where we could be renowned for a particular product type. So, for example, there are maintenance organisations in places in Europe or the US that are renowned for that particular platform. That's where you go for that particular platform, and they'll have 10 facilities, and they can do your painting, and they can do your deeper maintenance, and they can do your modifications, they can do your refurbs, and they can do everything all at once. But you need to be specialised to have that type of reputation to attract the volume that allows you to do just that. So if Australia wants to be that, how do we do that, and what are we going to invest in? So there's no doubt I have a tremendous amount of faith in Australian industry capability. And I believe in the strength of aviation capability globally simply because of the discipline that's inherent in aviation engineering and technical trades as a concept, the discipline that's taught, the rule following, the book following, the procedures, the process, the safety systems. I've got tremendous faith in all of that. But I do think from a marketing perspective, yes, could I fix that? I'm sure every country in the world, if given the opportunity, can fix something. But can you be the best in the world at that? That's where you want density of capability and density of demand to create that and to attract all that and attract the investment that makes that possible. I think that's where you're looking at an overarching coordinating role, potentially of government or non-conflicted commercial entities that can pull that together. So I do think that would be, look, if I was doing a magic wand scenario, that might be it. Strategically located, strategic capability, that can be globally focused in its benefit and what it can deliver to market.
Right. Okay. Well, Chris, I've taken enough of your time, if you will. Really appreciate your comments. It was a pleasure to get to know you a little bit better as well, in the family, if you will. So again, thank you very much. It's been great. It's been great.
No problems. Thanks, Jeff. Talk to you soon.